Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the fourth of our OpenSecrets Lobbying Masterclass sessions. I am Dan Auble. I manage our federal lobbying and revolving door projects. I'm joined today by Pete Quist, our Deputy Research Director, who is an expert in disclosure of money and state politics. And also joining us is Olivia Buckley, an OpenSecrets researcher who is doing research and developing resources actually on exactly the topic we're covering today, energy and environmental groups' influence. Also, thank you to our media team who will help run the Q&A at the end. Speaking of which, we will leave a good chunk of time at the end for questions, so please drop any you have in the Q&A chat you'll find at the bottom, and we'll address them at the end of our presentations. For anyone who may be unfamiliar with OpenSecrets, we are the leading money and politics data organization. We are nonprofit and nonpartisan. We collect disclosures from the federal government and the 50 states, ranging from things like campaign contributions to spending on ballot measures in the states, and of course, lobbying and the revolving door, which is mostly what we'll talk about today. This series we're hosting aims to educate you on what data is available, how to use lobbying disclosure reports in your work. And we'd like to thank the Omidyar Network for their support of this series, and as well as our work taking advantage of combining the state and federal lobbying data. Today, we'll be focusing on the lobbying activities of the energy and natural resources sector, as well as those of ideological and activist groups focused on the environment. We'll touch on the basics of lobbying data, but I also encourage you to watch some of our previous sessions, especially the first one, where we spent the entire time really looking in detail at what lobbying is and what information gets reported, where and how often, and a more thorough demonstration of the OpenSecrets tools you can use to augment your work and add context. We have, after this one, 2 more sessions. On October 18th, we'll be talking about big tech lobbying, and then on November 15th, we'll look at kind of a variety of social issues and other aspects of lobbying that we may not have covered yet as kind of a wrap-up session. And with that, I'll hand off to Pete to get us started. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Dan. So I'll start by defining a little bit more about what we're talking about when we're referring to lobbying and how it fits into other avenues of monetary political engagement in the American governing process. And then after that, we'll have Dan take a look at some of the trends and data within the federal data, and I will come in and draw comparisons and trends and data in the state data. And then Olivia will come in and talk about some of the exciting work that she's doing that Dan mentioned with our issue work. So what is lobbying? Here we're talking about the money spent by organizations to be represented at the Capitol, Congress, the US Capitol, or at the state Capitol. We collect lobbying data, the money spent on lobbying at the federal level, as well as in 19 states. We also do have data about who is registered to work for whom within lobbying in all 50 states. I'm not going to be focusing on that today, but just know that that is available. This is separate from contributions to political campaigns. So this is specifically the money that organizations are paying firms and lobbyists to represent them. In some cases, it will also be at the state level from time to time, and it is also the money that firms and lobbyists spend to actually do the lobbying activity itself. At the federal level, that activity isn't reported. However, almost all of the money spent on lobbying is how much a client such as AT&T or in this case, an energy company, maybe Northwestern Energy or something, might pay um, to lobbying firms and lobbyists to represent them. So if Dominion Energy pays, say, $1 million to a lobbying firm in Virginia to represent them at the Virginia State Capitol, that will be usually around 90% of the money or so associated with the lobbying effort. The other 10% or so being how much the lobbyists actually spend on like luncheons and parking and that kind of stuff. That compensation piece is the key aspect of lobbying disclosure because it is such a lion's share of the money. It also represents how much those clients are valuing those firms and lobbyists. It is a measurement really of how valuable those firms and lobbyists are and how valuable their time is, how effective they are. And we talked about this in the first one, but we have found in the past that firms and lobbyists aren't really hired typically for issue expertise. What they're hired for is connection expertise. A lot of these are revolving door folks. Their job is to get in the room and then send the message that the client has. I mentioned that this is separate from political contributions. It's also separate from independent expenditures. It really is the money spent to represent a client. Contributions are sort of integral to the process. Prior to this, though, academic research has shown that persons who make political contributions are more likely to be able to get meetings with elected officials. And you see corporations, including energy companies and nonprofit groups, including environmental groups, will make contributions to candidates, typically to incumbents, overwhelmingly to incumbents. The idea there is to open that door for lobbying. And so this is where we're going to focus on is the second step, the lobbying aspect of it. The reason that we get the data in 19 states rather than all states is largely because of that compensation piece. Compensation isn't reported in about half of the states. Lobbying data is really difficult to collect. It is not available in flat files really in most places, including at the federal level. It is a complex data set where the money just essentially isn't reported. We don't collect it. And then there are a few states where compensation is reported, but is not available in a very accessible format. So for example, if you have to go to the state capitol to make copies of reports, it's pretty difficult for us to do. And so we won't get it in those states. However, states are improving at putting things online. So hopefully we'll see that list of states increase as time goes on. We'll talk a little bit more about which states we have available when I get into the state data. But for now, I will pass it back to Dan to focus on the federal.
Great, thank you, Pete. And I will say that following on that quality of disclosure piece, the federal data, we do get a pretty good sense of what people are lobbying on and what their spending levels are. If all the states followed that as a model, I think we'd be in much better shape than the current landscape is. But having said that, let's get into the discussion of the energy industry and environmental groups and how they lobby. And the first thing I want to touch on is just kind of a comparison between energy and the environmental groups. Energy and natural resources spends more than 10 times what environmental groups do. And they have about 4 times the number of lobbyists. That's about 2,000 lobbyists versus 500. In 2022, the energy sector spent about $363 million on lobbying at the federal level, and they've spent $192 million so far this year. And that's as opposed to about $28 million spent in 2022 by the environmental groups and about $13 million so far this year. Now, it's worth mentioning that environmental groups actually spend more than their lobbying total in campaign activity. So when we look at the campaign spending side of things, usually lobbying spending is much bigger. But environmental groups, largely led by a few specific ones like the League of Conservation Voters or individual people, are making unlimited contributions to super PACs or spending on independent expenditures targeting candidates themselves. However, keep in mind that the energy companies are also spending or giving a lot in campaign contributions, and their totals are, again, several times as big as the environmental groups in that campaign contribution area. But let's dive right into some of the issues back in lobbying that the energy sector and environmental groups focus on. A bit of an overview: when we talk about energy and natural resources sector companies, we're including companies that do oil and gas production and refining, mining of coal and metals and other things, electric, gas, and water utilities, and even alternative and renewable energy producers. So while it's kind of a diverse group with some different interests, they very often have overlapping priorities. Note that that alternative energy category that I mentioned is increasingly has a lot of activity from more conventional energy companies, even oil companies. So like BP or Exxon will have a renewable division or subsidiary. And then the environmental groups, of course, as kind of a smaller, more focused group, are easier to describe. There are the big groups like League of Conservation Voters, all the way down to groups that have more specific land use interests or focused on specific wildlife preservation issues. So those are the two groups that we're talking about that are often opposed to each other, especially when it comes to things like energy use and climate change. But let's first take a look at some of the bills that were mentioned most often by these groups. Both the industry and the environmental groups most often targeted the this year, at least, the Lower Energy Costs Act. Now, this was HR 1 and was one of the first things the Republican House passed this year. And it aims to increase domestic production. It takes aim at regulations and tries to increase permitting and leases. And in a way, sometimes tries to undo some of the things that the Inflation Reduction Act enacted the previous Congress, which was, the most lobbied bill in that Congress. Both types of groups also aimed at things like appropriations bills and funding the government. That's normal. Those are always the most lobbied bills in general, so there's no real surprise there. But as you go down the list, the industry tended to focus on things like infrastructure security bills and other efforts to lower restrictions on things like permitting, while the environmental groups most often focused on ecosystem protection and wildlife management. I will note that I noticed looking at this that among these top 10 most targeted bills, Senate bills only showed up being mentioned twice on the industry side among these top 10, while 4 of the ones on the environmental side were Senate bills. So maybe there's an indication of the receptivity of the party controlling those 2 chambers that may be a factor there. I will also mention that this list you're looking at also illustrates one of the frustrating things about federal lobbying data. We can't determine how much money was spent on a particular bill or a specific issue, since each organization reports lobbying as a total quarterly number covering all their activity across all issues. So when I'm talking about these top 10 bills, I'm really looking at how many different organizations or companies reported on them, just as a gauge of how important it was to that group. Now, looking at bills as we have here, or issues like general issue areas, is a good way to focus in on some of what the industry considers to be the most important topics. This applies for individual companies or trade groups as well. And so I'll kind of go through and we'll look at one of the biggest ones and dig into what you can find on OpenSecrets about lobbying. So here we're on the energy and natural resources sector page for lobbying. Oh, actually, we are not. Let me just pull it up real quick. And you'll see that energy and natural resources ranks in the top half of our, dozen or so big sectors. But of course, there are several different industries, like I described, that are part of this sector. So at the top of the page here, you get some summary information where you can see trends over time in both the spending and how many lobbyists were employed. But then clicking on any specific industry will give you a similar chart, and then you can kind of get into which companies are the biggest. So I'm going to use an energy company as an example, but you'll also find all of the same information I'm talking about here, on the League of Conservation Voters page or other environmental groups. One useful thing about these summary charts here at the top, you can, of course, look at whether there may have been trends over time. So, for instance, you can see that maybe recently they're starting to ramp back up their lobbying spending. But you can also see spikes like this one in 2009 that corresponded to a fight over an Obama administration climate legislation fight. And you'll see that on certain companies as well. I know if you look at ExxonMobil, for instance, their 2009 spending is way higher than the surrounding years. But let's just look at our top company here, Occidental. And first thing, again, you get a summary idea of their spending over time. This time we break it down. You can see what they spent each quarter. And of course, the line there is how many lobbyists they've employed. Moving across these tabs here for more specific information that we get from the reports. This is all the lobbying firms that they hired and how much they paid them. Many companies have their own in-house lobbying teams, as Occidental has. You can see here that they spent only about $500,000 so far this year hiring outside firms out of their almost $6 million in total spending. Companies will sometimes hire a dozen or dozens of lobbying firms. Occidental is keeping it mostly in their own team, but obviously they are spending a substantial amount of money on outside support. We can also see the individual lobbyists who reported lobbying on their behalf, again, both in-house and from the outside firms. Clicking on any of their the lobbyist names will take you to a profile for that person that will show you anyone else, any other companies they represented, and even what campaign contributions they made on their own behalf as an individual. Clicking on the little circular arrow icon next to a person's name will take you to their revolving door profile, where we'll have an employment history for them, including jobs they've had with the government that they're now being paid to try and influence. Looking at issues, you'll see here, they they organize their reports in these broad issue categories like taxes and chemicals and Medicare, those kind of things. You'll see this number over here is just how many reports were filed that mentioned that issue. And clicking those will take you to the specific text that they actually wrote on the report. Now, this is especially useful if they do hire a lot of lobbying firms, because then there will be a lot of reports for you to go through one by one if you were to do that, since each lobbying firm will file a report each quarter for the work they did on behalf of Occidental. So we make it easy to see all of that at once by showing the text from all those different filings right here, along with links to the source documents here on the left, if you want to see the actual report where they reported this. So this is the description of their activity, where you'll find bills and legislation listed, but also sometimes more detailed descriptions of the issues they're working on, like what we see here. So this is a case where if you're interested in something very specific, like any mention of carbon capture or some kind of specific regulation that you want to see what organizations are targeting it, we can search this text to get a more complete picture than just looking at bills, which are sometimes quite broad and contain several issues within them. They also report what agencies they've targeted for lobbying purposes. The House and Senate appear on over 90% of reports that are filed. So it's safe to say that pretty much everyone is lobbying Congress, and they're not required to report anything more specific than House or Senate. So unfortunately, we don't know, they don't report which member's office they're meeting with or what committees, for instance. But knowing what executive branch agencies and offices they worked on is also really useful and can help you kind of connect the dots. While Congress is probably paramount and obviously gets a lot of the attention, the regulatory fights that go on in EPA and the Energy Department and Interior are also huge in terms of influence. So seeing what agencies they lobbied can help you with things like targeting a FOIA request maybe, or determining where you want to mine sources, or even if you see something that is not obvious, you may say like, okay, why are they lobbying the Coast Guard? And you may want to see if there's anything interesting there through your reporting. And then, of course, we list the bills that they've mentioned, and report images will take you to a list of links to the actual, we get them from this, we'll send you to the Senate office to see an image of the actual filing if you want to go back to the source. So that's kind of a brief look at how you can use our resources to get into the details of federal lobbying reports easily. You should also check out the piece that we just published focusing on Occidental's carbon capture lobbying. But with that, I will hand off to Pete to talk about how things work at the state level.
Thanks, Dan. And I'll share my screen here. What we'll be looking at is our followthemoney.org website. Some of you may be familiar with this website already. We didn't really get into it. It's been a couple of years now, but we are merging these databases. The OpenSecrets organization actually formed in 2021 from the merger of the Center for Responsive Politics, which operated the OpenSecrets.org website, and the National Institute on Money and Politics, which operated the followthemoney.org website. The Center and the OpenSecrets website focus primarily on the federal data, particularly in this lobbying context, whereas the state data was available on Follow the Money through the Institute's website. We're going to take a look at that here. In the states, the data is available in 19 states, as I mentioned at the top of the presentation, where we have compensation reported and data available in an accessible nature. To view data on this website, it is very much a query-based website, but we can go up to this Ask Anything button in the upper right. What I'm about to show you is not super user-friendly for folks who haven't used it before. What it is meant to do is allow you to answer any question that you can come up with if the answer is available within our data set. So there are a lot of options here. I want to state up front that the idea is for you to sort of get a sense of what's available and then reach out to us if you need to for help getting going on looking at data for an article or even to just complement an article. With that Ask Anything button, when I click that in the upper right, I get this pop-up. We're focusing on lobbying data here, so I'm going to switch this off the contributions into lobbying. And then we get a few options to look at lobbying data. I'm going to just pull up the lobbying data by the last few years. You see we have data going back to 2002. I'm going to just go back to 2015 on this for demonstration purposes. Now I'm showing me lobbying spending in selected years, and I've got those years listed there. I'm going to click on Go. And then I'm going to, and I will echo Dan's comments, check out our first webinar. We'll share a link on that here in the chat. And that has a more in-depth how-to on how to do this and how to do this querying. So that's in the chat there. With this search, I can click on filing jurisdiction, and that is going to total my lobbyist spending data for these years by state. So what I've done here is queried all of our state lobbying data in these years. I've gotten an overall result here with about $15 billion in lobbying in these states. And then I'm basically making an Excel pivot table. So I'm totaling by state. So this is the amount of money that we've documented spent on lobbying in California during these years. I will note also that everything that I do here is going to be reflected in the URL. URLs can then be embedded in online articles or saved to come back to the same table and look at the data as well. Not too surprising here that our biggest states are California, New York, Florida, and Texas. These are just big states in general in terms of money and politics. But we are, this is not limited to energy and environmental interests. This is just everything that we have, just to provide a context of the dollars that are available here. I'm going to alter this query to look specifically at the energy and environmental interests. So this pop-up will look familiar, and I'm going to do spender by industry. We've got energy and natural resources. This is a very broad classification. I do want to point out that everything that I'm going to suggest from the energy sector is going to be within here, however. With this little black arrow, we can get to our mid-tier classifications. So if I were to click this energy and natural resources box, it will include things like fisheries and hunting interests and that sort of thing. This is based off the federal industry classification systems. I'm going to instead specifically click on a few different energy interests, we'll go with oil and gas, and we'll throw those in. Oops, and I also actually want to include the environmental groups. So we'll just grab these again. Throw miscellaneous in there. And then our environmental groups are primarily under ideology and single issue groups. You see we have lots of classifications for these here. We'll go in pro-environmental policy. So now I'm looking at state level lobbying spending by these industries within those years. And again, I've got the state box selected, so we're going to end up totaling these by year over the last almost 10 years or so here. And this will take just a moment. It is actually building the queries for you as it runs. But we will continue to see California and Texas at the top of the list. These are both big states with a lot of energy interests, and they kind of stand out from the rest. But you can see now how those sort of line up. Within any table on this database, you can actually dive into the row of data that makes up the data that makes up that row. You can use the magnifying lens on the left side of any table to do that. So by doing this, I'm clicking on the Texas data. We're just going to have a look at how energy and environmental issues spending sort of stack up. I'm clicking on sector, and because I clicked the mid-tier classification items, what we're going to see are the industries within each sector. So those industries that I selected are listed here, and then you can see the sector items here. But just displaying by sector, we can get kind of an overall comparison of how energy and environmental groups sort of stack up against each other for lobbying spending in Texas. And as we would all expect, energy certainly outspends environmental interests in Texas. Texas has a very big energy industry, of course, but this is one of the more stark differences. Dan mentioned that at the federal level, it's about a 10-to-1. That is a little bit more common at the state level. Texas sort of stands out with all the spending by the energy industry. If we click on a state such as California, we can draw a comparison. And again, this is still 2015 to current. So a little bit more normalized here in California. In fact, it's a little higher than 10%. I'm going to limit this California data to just a few recent years for purposes of demonstrating some more functionality here and taking a look at what the energy interests are doing and who they are. So we're just going to limit this to the last 3 years. Let's take a look at who the players are. This spender box will actually show me the names of the spenders, and then I will also include the industry level classification so we can see where they fit in. Western States Petroleum Association is typically among the top spenders by any group in any industry in California. There are a few that sort of tend to be the top spenders in California lobbying. These are one of them, Western States. The California Teachers Association Union is another. They have about 4 or 5 that sort of switch around. Chevron Corp is typically one of the bigger ones in California as well. And then the Energy Foundation, which is based in California, I believe, is an environmental group that tends to spend a lot, but we don't see a lot of other environmental spending in comparison to the overall total. But this is a breakdown of who those organizations are. Unfortunately, at the state level, we typically don't get the kind of data that Dan was talking about with the bills that they're lobbying on or the issues that they're lobbying on. California is a state where that is provided. Most states do not provide that. However, in California, I can't display this because the way that it's provided is a huge text field where they just write in all kinds of things that they're working on in one, if you think of it as like an Excel spreadsheet, as in one cell. And there aren't standardized ways to look at bills. Bill numbers may or may not be included in the big written descriptions and that sort of thing. That said, California is one of the few states where that information is available at all. So kudos to them for that. However, we can take a look at what groups might be trying to do on pieces of legislation through other means. This is NCSL's website. For those that aren't familiar with NCSL, it's the National Conference of State Legislatures. This organization its primary mandate is to inform legislative policy for legislators and their staff. However, it has some cool resources available for the public as well. I'm going to click on this resources link and research and policy. The link to the tool that I'm about to show you will be included in a follow-up email for those who registered for this conference or for this webinar as well, as will others. Don't have to remember exactly how to get here, but I'm going to click on this NCSL 50 state searchable bill tracking database. You can see bills by topic area here. I'm going to click on energy. And then you get a lot of information about these bills. I'm going to sort of gloss over this, but I want to click on climate change or carbon capture and storage. And I'm going to focus in on Texas here in 2023. And then here are a list of the bills about carbon capture in Texas from this year. We'll see kind of a pattern here. Carbon capture bills tend to fail, usually in a committee. And this is pretty typical of where bills will die. If they are going to die, it's going to be assigned to a committee, and then the committee will not act on it or will vote it down. As an example of the money associated with that committee's consideration of a bill, we can go back to follow the money and actually take a look at, and this is going to be a little bit outside of lobbying, but I want to mention it because it is associated with lobbying. We'll go into the Texas legislature for 2023. So this is a tool where we can look at contributions to legislators that are considering certain pieces of legislation, including by committee. We have every bill for every session streamed from a corporation called Legiscan. Here's the bill that we're looking at. These sponsors, and if I click on this, I can actually get to a list of the contributions to the sponsor. Or I can click on this and get that, or I can get the events here, and again, get that committee name. And if I go to the Senate Natural Resources and Economic Development Committee, under this committee's tab, then I can see who those members are, see who those contributions are. I'm actually going to jump right into this interface so we can get into that more familiar interface as you continue to work on this website that will allow you to look at things like the industry and the recipients of the money. So we can see how much is raised by each person, and then we can look at things like the energy industry, which I'll just pull up here. And I'm glossing over this a little bit. Again, the idea is to know what is available. We can certainly help you build these data sets or put links together for you, send you data as needed during your work. Here are the contributors to members of this committee from those energy interests or environmental groups. I will note that Texas has no contribution limits for contributions to state candidates. So you can write as large of a check as you'd like to anyone running for office in Texas, for state office, not congressional office. So you can get some pretty big contributions. This means that Tim Dunn, who is an oil and gas magnate in Texas, wrote 5 checks totaling $215,000. Then you can add in who has received that money. So 2 of those checks went to Kevin Sparks for $200,000. So this allows you then to look at, as bills are dying in committee, or as a committee is considering a bill, or if a bill passes, to look at the efforts by the industry to make contributions to elected officials. Again, keeping in mind that those contributions are often meant to open the door for lobbying. And so tying this all together, this is a great way to tie contributions to actual policy outside of even the elections. So very, very brief look there, but we do have quite a few things available for you and lots of different data sets. This is, again, focused primarily on energy and environment, but this is available for other issues as well. So please do reach out to us with any questions about what might be available for what you're working on. And with that, I will pass it over to Olivia. And we will have a Q&A at the end. I just want to put this in the chat, but you have a Q&A box within your Zoom control bar. Just go ahead and pop in any questions in there. We will have a verbal Q&A session at the end here for about 15 or 20 minutes. So Olivia.
Thanks, Pete. So just to start out with, I wanted to introduce a little bit about the work that I am doing at OpenSecrets. So I am the dedicated researcher for our Issues Center project. And what I want to do today is just give a little bit of a brief overview of what the Issues Center is, or what it's going to be, and share a little bit of a preview of our next issue profile, which is going to cover climate and environmental issues. So the goal of the project broadly is to create a series of issue profiles that will consolidate our data around those issues and provide a little bit of additional context and insight to help make that data as legible as possible to the general public, as well as to members of the media or other organizations who might be interested in using it. So far, we've published one issue profile on cryptocurrency, which is a little bit of a light version of what we have coming up in the future for other issues, but definitely check that out if that interests you. So one of the really exciting elements of this project is that it's going to include more extensive data visualizations that will incorporate federal and state data and should go a long way towards encouraging readers of the site to kind of interact with and explore the data on their own, as well as kind of understand some of the narratives that emerge around those issues from our angle of money and politics and these kind of networks of influence that we're talking about today. We'll also be including trends in contributions and other than lobbying and outside spending, as well as relevant policy developments that can sort of shed some light on those trends. In conjunction with the issue profiles, we're planning also to partner with media and advocacy organizations to offer some kind of training on how they might be able to use our data in their work. So as far as the climate profile, the bulk of that issue profile is going to be concerned with the energy sector in general, and more specifically oil and gas, as well as environmental groups and their political activity, which you all have heard a little bit about today. Lobbying spending in the oil and gas industry specifically has really ramped up in the last 20 years as there's been more kind of policy mobilization around climate change and limiting emissions. So that I think will be really helpful to kind of encourage people to scrutinize and look into themselves. We'll also be looking at other high pollution industries. That includes chemical manufacturing, which is another major source of air pollution and other environmental contaminants. And another subject that I'm really excited to include, which you all have heard a little bit about today, is carbon capture and storage. It's becoming an extremely profitable industry in its own right, and also something that oil and gas companies are really invested in as a potential path towards meeting emission targets or working towards emission targets while still preserving the profitability of their businesses. Dylan, I think, actually linked a story about that in the chat that I would definitely recommend reading if that's something that interests you. There's also been a lot of money allocated for carbon removal as part of the Biden legislative agenda. So I think it will be really useful to explore how that industry is developing and what its kind of interests are as far as policy. So I think that does it for my little preview of the climate profile, which I hope you'll all check out when it goes up. And I think I'm going to pass it back to Dan to wrap up.
Yes, thank you. So we kind of covered a lot of ground today and touched on a few things that I'd like to reiterate, which is just that in addition to all of the lobbying information we covered, we also have all kinds of information on campaigns and nonprofits and lobbying by foreign organizations. So I would encourage you just to kind of poke around the site and check out everything we have. And always feel fully welcome to get in touch with us if you have questions about what you're seeing, or if you need custom data that you don't see on the websites. We're happy to work with you to get you what you need. And I think that's it. We can move on to Q&A. I believe Dylan's going to lead us through that.
Yes, so at this moment, I don't have any new questions. Most of them I have kind of already answered as far as like when the videos are going to be available. So if any of the participants want to take a couple of minutes to get any questions as we close out, we'll get those answered pretty quickly.
Dan, can you talk a little bit about organizations that sort of claim to be pro-environment, but maybe established for or funded by energy companies and how we might work on classifying those?
Yeah, so I mean, those of course don't self-identify themselves, which makes it difficult, but our system of classifying groups involves usually looking them up. For something like a greenwashed group, we also do work with tax filings by nonprofits where we take a look at the major funders and what groups are moving money around. So that's one place we can look to kind of tip us off that some organizations may be related, that where it's not otherwise apparent. We don't really have a specific code for that kind of organization, but when we come across them, we note them. So we could, if someone is looking specifically at that type of organization, we could take a look, but it is somewhat subjective. We typically need a pretty bright line before we will consider something in a different industry than what they say themselves. But I think that's a great topic to point to for further research.
Yeah, and I'll just add that happens in other industries as well. And sometimes those lines can move over time. For example, as Dan mentioned, a lot of the clean energy companies we're in a place where the industry is changing. And some of the solar companies or hydro companies are being purchased by companies that have more traditional environmental practices. And so those lines can move a little bit as well as the industry changes. We saw something kind of similar about 10 years ago as marijuana was being legalized and tobacco companies started buying marijuana companies and that sort of thing too. So sometimes these groups will be funded by companies that begin to get an interest in kind of newer versions of I guess, energy, and so that line can kind of shift. We don't have like a greenwashing or classifications within other industries that are specific to groups that we think are not being honest about what they're doing, though. And we just try to classify them based on where they get their funding. We have a question about environmental groups relying more on political contributions than lobbying. I think the point that Dan and I were trying to make, both of us, were that actually in this case, We just have a situation where one side of the debate is much more heavily funded than the other. Not so much that environmental groups are relying on large contributions and not relying on lobbying. In this particular instance, most of the money is in the energy industry as opposed to in the environmental industry. That can change. Sometimes you'll see an industry, because lobbying can be funded from essentially any source, and the same thing can happen with independent expenditures as well. You might see sometimes a very wealthy individual get involved in an industry like this from the ideological perspective. We do see some ballot measure engagement, for example, by Tom Steyer, who is many of you have probably heard of, a wealthy hedge fund manager, or was a hedge fund manager. I think he's retired now, but engages in ballot measure activity, making large contributions in the pro-environmental sort of side of that. But the lobbying is typically done by established organizations, sometimes nonprofit organizations, oftentimes companies. And in this case, we're just seeing a mismatch on the money.
Okay, so I have one question here that asks about insight on tracking down incomplete data. So the question says, I was recently poking around on the Commissioner of Political Practices site for info for the state legislator and found that the data reported was incomplete. The name of the lobbyist had been included in a report, but not the money paid to that individual. Any insight on tracking down info when a filing is incomplete?
Yeah, I'll start on that one. Montana is a challenge for us specifically. By the way, I'm in Montana. I'm located in Helena. So the Commissioner of Political Practices office is kind of just down the street from me. The collecting data at the state level is a real challenge. The filings are oftentimes sort of provided in different avenues. In Montana, there is an electronic filing system for lobbying disclosures. However, there is also a paper filing system for electronic disclosures. So you may need to look at both to find the complete data for a report. Montana is actually the only state so far where we have in the past collected the money spent on lobbying and no longer collect it because of challenges with ensuring that the data is complete. And so this is not overly surprising for me that you're running into something like that. That's not to say Montana is the only state where we've had to do that in other data sets. It happens from time to time. But in terms of the money spent on lobbying, which is a relatively newer data set for us, we've only been doing it for about 10 or 15 years. That's the first one. But this is absolutely a thing where I will just add that state agencies oftentimes do not have anybody in tech on staff, and so they have to hire it from other agencies or from contractors. It is a challenge for them, and as they move to electronic systems, we have seen other examples where those systems have not worked particularly well. And so call them up. Those folks are usually they work there because they believe in disclosure for the most part, and they may be able to help you out. Dan, I don't know if you see that much at the federal level. Certainly federal lobbying is a very professional, big money kind of arena.
Yes, that's exactly right. And I mean, these reports are filed with both the House and Senate public disclosure offices, and they are pretty responsive when we find something that's missing, as are filers generally. They will file amendments if we find something wrong. As you say, it's pretty professionalized at the federal level, and most lobbyists and companies want to be above board. And there's a lot of attention, of course, focused on federal lobbying.
So the next one I'll bring up from our Q&A might go beyond the scope of this webinar, but it's good to touch on anyway, I think. We have one question that asked, how would we be able to trace and identify dark money going to lobbying efforts?
Do you want to start, Dan, or I can jump in?
Sure. I mean, in general, like what I mentioned about looking at nonprofit tax filings and how the money is moving around is one way that we get at it, and kind of joining that information with anything that gets reported to the FEC, because if they actually start electioneering or running ads that mention specific candidates, for instance, they need to disclose a little bit more about what they're doing and what their sources of funding are. So comparing that with the organization's tax filings can shed some light. But I'd be happy. I mean, Pete, I don't know if you have anything to add, but we can also put you in touch. We do have a couple experts on staff to talk about dark money who would be able to help you navigate that space, I think.
Yeah, and I'll sort of elaborate on something that Dan mentioned, in that this lobbying data is where we're focusing our presentations on, but we have other data sets that we tie to the same groups, and so we can see other engagement that those groups are making. It doesn't necessarily help us always see where the money is coming from, but can provide some additional context for your reporting. At the state level, dark money groups can oftentimes make contributions directly to candidates in addition to running independent expenditures, so we will see those. Some states have better disclosure requirements than others about where that money comes from once groups get engaged in the actual election aspect of money in politics. And so sometimes we can get some additional data at the state level. Not always. States tend to be kind of poor at this, but every once in a while we get lucky.
Cool. So as we begin to wrap up, I'll just plug this one last pretty short question. The question is, are there any fees associated with the assistance provided to those seeking help formulating searches for particular data sets? And also, is this assistance provided in real time, or is there a time lag? And then that will be our closing question. So I'll let you take it from there, Pete.
Sure. Our mandate as a 501c3 organization that lives to make data available is to make data available as much as we can. We spend a lot of time working in spreadsheets and databases. I don't know if you picked up on this, but we're kind of data heads. But it is great to see all the work that we're doing to put this stuff together for you be put to use. So we very much want to make this available for free as much as possible. That said, we're a small 501c3 charitable organization trying to keep the lights on. If your request will involve special research for us or us building kind of a special data set, we will have to have a conversation about fees. We try to keep fees to a minimum, though. We certainly don't want that to be a barrier to good reporting. Good reporting is a huge part of why we do this. An informed electorate is an essential aspect to a functioning democracy, and it is media's role to make sure that that happens, and our role to help. Yes, fees can come up, but generally we will try to keep those out and minimized if we have to start talking about those conversations. I will add that we are working on trying to build more partnerships with media as well. Folks who have registered for this webinar will get more information about that in the next few days. And so keep an eye out for that. Also, you'll get an email with the links that we've shared in the chat today and a link to register for future webinars. And I want to thank again the Open Data Network for funding these webinars and our work with the lobbying data. And I want to thank you all for coming. And thank you. Take care.